Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for attending. We've got a pretty full plate here, so I'll go through this pretty quickly here. But just a really brief background here on NGBM. It was really started to help advisors across Canada become better advisors. It was grown from the CGIB breakfast that were all very local and designed to take a much more national approach to all things benefits so that we can all just be better at what we do. So we host two kind of open forum question and answers a year and two webinar sessions a year. And this is obviously one of our webinar sessions. Today's session, we are excited, whether it's drug caps, canceling plans, or large increases, benefit plans are all feeling the pressure of these newer high-cost drugs. We wanted today to focus on the other side of the story, from the drug manufacturer to the pharmacist to the insurer. How can we all understand this issue better, help our clients understand this issue better, and work better together through this to make sure the plans remain sustainable while people can still access the drugs they need? So a couple of housekeeping items. So if you want to leave your camera off, that might help with bandwidth. And also just make sure that you're muted. And all questions, if you can put them right into the question box at the very end, we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A. And when you are putting your questions in the question box, please just say who it's for. So if it's for Kevin, one of our speakers, just put Kevin's name in front of the questions and so on. And so no further ado, we've got Kevin O'Connor as our first speaker, and he's the National Director for Federal and Private Healthcare for Janssen Inc. And Janssen is a wholly owned by Johnson & Johnson, representing the corporation's pharmaceutical business. Janssen has treated in several disease areas, including biologics, oncology, mental health, and diabetes, pulmonary disorder, and vaccines. Kevin has worked for Johnson & Johnson for 30 years, holding positions in the commercial business and public and private market access. He has worked with advisors and insurers for 15 years. So please take it away, Kevin.
I almost said good morning. It is good afternoon at this point for everybody who's in Ontario. I know, Jay, good morning to you. I know it's 9 a.m. Anyway, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here and glad to have the opportunity to speak. So the cadence that my presentation will go through will end with drugs for rare diseases. But what I will go through is what the process is after Health Canada, the process for medications to go through the other regulatory units that exist in Canada that lead to public listings. There is a connection to those with some private insurers. We'll talk about the different drug programs and try and be specific about drugs for rare diseases. I will talk about patient assistance programs and how they've operated around rare diseases. And then I will end with what the current events are on the considerations for funding models for drugs for rare diseases. Okay. So, as much as we got prepared ahead of time, there we go. My screen wasn't advancing for a second. So after Health Canada has given the drug its marketing authorization or its notice of compliance, there's really two organizations come into play. CADTH and INESS, which are two organizations unto themselves, they mirror each other. INESS is specific for Quebec, CADTH is for the entire country, and these are effectively HTA organizations. So I thought about putting up a slide as a reference for the acronyms, so hold on, and I'll try and use as few acronyms as possible. So CADTH and INESS are HTAs, so that's Health Technology Assessments. So after the drug gets its marketing authorization, both of these organizations do a re-review of the clinical evidence, and they do it from a health economics perspective. They also do it from the perspective, they also utilize health economics models that are submitted to them. And really what these two organizations are doing, they're looking to be able to see what the worth of the drug is beyond just the price of the drug. So they look at things like societal benefits. For private insurance values like productivity, absenteeism, etc., that really isn't considered in those worlds. Like economics, health economics is a science, but there is an art to it. And sometimes you'll see some very differing outcomes from these two organizations. But their outcomes always land in a recommendation. And the recommendation is to either not list, so they recommend that public drug programs do not pay for these drugs, or they'll recommend that they list the medication and pay for it. Generally, that recommendation also comes with a secondary recommendation to negotiate the price. Okay. These two organizations are very tight with their timelines. They set a target of 6 months to do their work, and then there can be up to 4 to 8 weeks afterwards where there's a little bit of back and forth between the manufacturer and the organizations, but they're very, very tight with their timelines. After the recommendations have been given by CADTH, there is the PCPA, which is the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance, and this is the bulk purchasing body for the provinces. So they'll take the drugs that have been recommended for listing and they'll enter into negotiations with the manufacturer. Unlike CADTH and NES, it isn't a first in, first out. And so the provinces who make up the membership, provinces and the federal drug programs who make up the membership, they will determine what drugs are going to be negotiated. And, I will not speak on behalf of PCPA, but, our knowledge of it is that this is the drugs that are chosen in the order that they are chosen is based on the interests of the province. So sometimes you will get a letter of engagement. Sometimes that will come within a month of the drug getting its CADTH recommendation. And sometimes it takes months, or we've even experienced a couple medications that have been closing in on 2 years. The whole process to go after a drug gets its Health Canada notice of compliance to getting provincial payers listing the drug is the average is about 576 days. Generally, private insurance is listing sooner. They're doing their review a little more expedited. There are some insurers that are waiting for CADTH recommendations, which is, a very reasonable thing to do because they're getting a little more insight into the data. While this is going on, there is a parallel process by a group called the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board. So PMPRB is the next acronym I'll introduce. And this is the federal agency that sets the price of the medications in Canada. So manufacturers will present their price, and then Patent Medicine Price Review Board will do a number of tests, and they will determine whether the price is the accurate price based on their tests. Drugs in Canada have been regulated for over 25 years. The regulations have not changed in 25 years, and occasionally you're going to see some articles in the paper about pricing regulations in Canada changing. And so this is still a process that's going on now. And as you can imagine, it's got lots of inputs into it from stakeholders. So after the drug is listed, I'm going to go through the provincial formularies and again, keep an eye to rare diseases. So that'll be coming on the next slide. There is harmony across the country with the provincial systems for persons who are 65 years of age and persons with disabilities that prevent employment. This exists in every single province. Okay, there are some nuances that exist, but effectively, once folks are 65 plus years of age, or if they have a disability preventing income or preventing employment, they're covered by the province. Ontario has a thing called OHIP Plus, which is for uninsured persons 25 years and younger without private insurance. Where the differences exist are in Quebec. All persons without private insurance do have access to public insurance, so it's an income-based deductible. With the exception of persons over 65 years of age, there isn't an intersection or blending with the public or with the private programs. In Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and BC, they're called pharmacare provinces, and it's an income-based deductible where all persons in those provinces have access to the public program after their deductible is fulfilled, and that blends with private insurance. Okay, the call out here is all of the benefits are limited to the drug formularies of the provincial programs. Government programs that are underwritten, underwritten by the government, and they are intended for the uninsured or the underinsured. In Alberta, there's Alberta non-group, which is generally a fixed deductible, and it integrates with private insurance plans. And I know it's relatively common that the private insurance programs are blended with Alberta non-group. In Ontario, there's Trillium, which is an income-based deductible, and there is integration with private insurance. And in Quebec, the integration with private insurance really exists only with persons 65 years of age and over. The call out here with the difference between Alberta and Ontario, both are programs that provide the drug benefit lists that their respective public programs have. Alberta, the deductible is very low. Ontario, for Trillium, the debate is the deductible is fairly aggressive, and that has deterred some people from pursuing it. Okay, in oncology, this is an area that starts to tip into rare diseases by some person's definition. In BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, so effectively the West, oral and IV treatments are paid for the province by all residents. Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic, it's just IV treatments are paid by hospitals for all residents. Oral and injectable treatments are paid for the province by those people that are qualifying for the ODB program or RAMQ. Any oral treatments for the under 65 population or injectable where they can be injected outside of the hospital, those are falling to private insurance plans. Now, drugs, being very specific for drugs for rare diseases, there are, and I've noted up at the top, special envelope programs. Historically, when there was a program for a high-cost drug in a very specific area, provinces were receiving a special envelope of funding. And that's the historical name and the genesis for these programs. This began in an era where there really was not the frequency of treatments available for rare diseases was very limited. It wasn't what it is today and where we're trending to in the future. So there are some legacy programs, like for example, for HIV, renal and kidney disease, and transplant. There are no modern programs. So at risk of dating myself, I'd say between 15 and 20 years, we haven't seen a new program begin with a special envelope of funding. So for drugs for rare diseases, it fits really just into the framework of federal and provincial drug programs and the business that you guys are in with private plans. There are proposals for drugs for rare disease, and the federal government has held, I was going to call it hearings, but I guess for lack of a better word, hearings where proposals were accepted from stakeholders. And what has come out of it? So it is in the mandate of our sitting government to have a program for, or have a framework for drugs for rare disease. So something should be coming, or maybe better said, when it's in a government mandate, it's intended to be addressed. As you look into those proposals that have been submitted by stakeholders, the definition of a drug for rare disease needs to be landed on. It really spans a broad spectrum. When you look at the proposals, some are, there is the Canadian Organization for Rare Diseases, its acronym is CORD. They're very specific on what a rare disease is. There is wandering definitions that even go into oncology and suggest that oncology, or some cancers, can be considered a drug for rare disease. Some people or some organizations have put forward definitions of drugs for rare disease that are cost-based. So, above a certain cost, that should be considered a drug for a rare disease. versus the number of patients. So that has not been landed on. We're seeing proposals for a single payer for all Canadians. So that would be federal government funded and managed. So that would take the responsibility for paying for a treatment for a drug for rare disease and put it solely with the federal government. There are proposals for the existing systems to have special funding for rare diseases. So that would be obviously the public drug programs, not the private insurance programs, but it would just effectively leave the system where it is today, but identify drugs that are for rare diseases, and that federal money would be transferred to fund them. The Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association did submit a proposal, and inclusive of their proposal is a harmonized single review process for the country that includes both public and private, a single formulary with employers being responsible for the first $25,000 and the government paying for the balance. So, and that's a very high level summary. There's much more into it. But that's really where we are today for funding for drugs for rare diseases. It is left up to the individual federal programs. And when I'm referring to that, that would be Veterans Affairs, Department of National Defense, the formulary for First Nations, and the provincial programs, and of course, private insurance. Okay. This slide may be out of place or out of order. I struggled with it, and there's one slide after this, and then that's the end of my segment. Patient support programs, they've played a role, particularly in private insurance for drugs for rare disease or high-cost drugs as well. The patient support programs, you hear them acronymed as PSPs or patient assistance programs, PAPs. They have become table stakes in the industry in Canada, and it is something that is very North American centric. They are available with virtually all high-cost medications, so the specialty medications, where there is not a large number of patients. So let me give an analogy. For somebody for Crohn's disease, but they are not available for persons with diabetes because the numbers of persons with diabetes is so large. Okay. So the basic service model, reimbursement navigation. What I mean by that term is that's for where there's special authorization criteria. The patient will enroll. They will give over their okay to the patient assistance program to do an insurance investigation to find out whether the drug is a benefit on the plan, and then they'll help fill out the paperwork if there's a prior auth or special auth. There's compliance assist, or there's patient and caregiver disease information, and there's financial assistance. I'm going to address financial assistance after this section. The advanced service model, and this becomes really a decision by the pharmaceutical manufacturer on how much they want to invest into the program. And these programs are, they're helping patients. I do believe they do a lot of good for patients and caregivers, but they are also marketing tools as well that, if you're providing a really good service, the intention is that should make that can input into the decision of whether the drug is prescribed. The advanced service model, case management. So there may be a nurse or other healthcare practitioner that will help the patient and the caregiver navigate the disease and be available to answer more in-depth questions. Compliance assistance, where there will be a nudge sent to the patient that they are due for their the refill of their medication, or often with these specialty medications, if they're injectables or IVs, the compliance kicks in when the patient has missed their time for refill. Some of the programs have medical assessments and scales that are performed regularly, and there are electronic medical records that are available to the patient and the physicians to help guide them through their journey through their disease and help make them informed on treatment choices. New age models, there are some programs that have predictive analytics and are enrolling, or they're available to be enrolled into, even if the patient is not yet on the specific treatment. For financial assistance, historically, copay assistant and compassionate product has been made available for patients. The copay assistance or the copay burden to a patient on a higher cost drug, if it's 10% and it's, that 10% of a treatment for $30,000 can be a big impact to most of us. So there has been copay assistance that's been available, and there has been compassionate product when somebody's, for example, if somebody has lost their private insurance, or if they've hit a annual maximum. Okay. Some of these programs do means testing, where the patient will submit some of their financials, and that will drive how much financial assistance is available. Now, current and future constraints, the world is changing, and there is more uncertainty for pharmaceutical manufacturers than there has been in the past. And we're starting to see some constraints on services and assistance that is available for patients through their patient support programs. Safe to say, I do not know of a drug for rare disease, as I define a drug for rare disease, that does not have a patient support program. Okay. Switching gears, and this becomes part of what is available to private plans to manage costs, as long as you have drugs for rare diseases as your responsibility. And it also exists, this opportunity exists for all medications. So product listing agreements, again, this I think is going to be the last acronym I introduced to you, which is PLAs. These have been around with the public program since the early 2000s. I believe it has evolved into the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance, which is the bulk purchaser. It entered into the private insurance community later, and relatively recent, but the numbers of PLAs with private insurers is increasing. Many people will talk about, well, we should join into the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance. I think that's a matter of much debate and discussion. The complexity of a public PLA at times can take it to a point where it would be very difficult to mechanize that agreement with private insurers. But that statement is not to dissuade private insurers from doing product listing agreements. The designs generally that we see, I refer to them as first dollar rebates. So any dollar that is claimed by a plan member has a rebate percentage attached to it. There's also trial prescriptions where, say, for example, it's like a proof of concept. We want to see if the plan member is going to respond to the treatment, so they will be treated successfully. It's a trial prescription. And then there are patient capitation models, which is generally, an example would be generally in a year for a higher cost drug, a patient can claim up to, I'm going to make up a number, up to $15,000. And if they claim anything above that, then it is effectively 100% rebate. Okay. And I've seen a blending of all three. The mechanisms for this there are point of sale solutions where the actual rebate is applied at the pharmacy. So the plan sponsor does not experience the cost hitting their books. And there is an invoicing model as well. As PLAs or rebate agreements are newer to the private insurance landscape, I've had a regular question about, is there value to the plan sponsors? From a manufacturer's perspective, yeah, I don't think there's as much mystery to this as sometimes it is presented. I think there's a lot of value there, and there is a lot of savings that can be passed on. So in the end, where we are with drugs for rare diseases, there hasn't been a lot of progress from what has been the model over the last 10 years that we've seen an increasing number of both high cost drugs and drugs for rare diseases. I expect, because of the mandate that the federal government has included drugs for rare diseases, we should be seeing something. The shape of it, that's a crystal ball question. So, Jay, since I see you on the screen, how about I will pass it back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. That was fascinating, and there's so many different things that we could ask about if we only had the time. One thing I'd like to just quickly mention, because I bet you we have some people here listening today that don't know, when we're talking about high cost drugs, we're no longer talking about drugs that are, $500 or $1,000 a year. We're talking about drugs that can be in the hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars a year. So these various programs that you were talking about, really, for those people who don't know about them, they are unbelievably important to the changing drug landscape. But anyways, thank you very, very, very much for your time and your insights, Kevin. One of the things I do want to add about what's going on today is that we do have multiple speakers that have all offered their time at no charge. And one of the things for people who are just listening to all of this for the first time today, those of us organizing it, we don't charge anything for attendance. We are not supported or paid by any insurance companies. We are completely insurance company agnostic. So the points here today, should we have somebody from an insurance company, for instance, it's because they're speaking on a more general concept. Just want to make sure that everybody is clearly aware of that. I want to move to our next speaker. Our time is very tight today. Our next speaker is Kimberly Kaleo. Kim is an engineer who turned into a community pharmacist. Kim lives and works in Castlegar, BC. Since graduating from UBC in 2017, Kim has been drawn to preventative health, therapeutic nutrition, and functional medicine. Kim's passionate about educating the public with these topics, whether at the pharmacy counter or on her blog at caleofunctionalpharmacy.com. When not pursuing her interest in healthcare, Kim can be found in the mountains, hiking, mountain biking, and backcountry skiing. Kim also volunteers with Castlegar Search and Rescue, and she enjoys all that nature can give. Kim, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Jay. I'm just going to get my slides up here. All right, can everyone see that?
We can see it.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so my talk is called How to Help Your Pharmacist Help You. And I've made it with the intention of it being able to be shared with your clientele. So it's going to be a little bit more verbose as far as what I would normally put on slides. And it's written for the perspective of the patient to be able to read it. You know, we all are patients at the end of the day, so that kind of works. So we're going to get going here. So I have two areas of focus today, dealing with your pharmacist in the short term and dealing with your pharmacist in the long term. So in the short term, we're talking about how do you get the right prescription for the right condition, make sure it's safe for you and that it's not too expensive, or you understand how the billing works. And then how do you talk to your pharmacist in the long term? So developing a therapeutic relationship with them and thinking long term about your financial health. Word of warning, I do live with an animal, well, two animals, a fiance and my dog Aries. They're both rather domesticated, but he may steal the show. So in the short term, I want to talk a little bit about responsibilities. So both the patient and the pharmacist have responsibilities in the relationship that they have with each other. Pharmacist responsibilities, you would normally think about in terms of probably just the technical part. So you bring the prescription to the pharmacist, they're going to fill it into a container and give it back to you. So that actually, when you look at the full scope of a responsibility for a pharmacist, it's pretty minor. It's the technical part there. The The pharmacist has a pretty big clinical role to play, and that's not overly known in the public. So I wanted to highlight that here. And then also just to show that while the billing takes up a pretty big amount of time and headache for the pharmacist, it's actually a very minor part of our responsibilities. So to flesh out the clinical responsibilities a little bit more, for every prescription that a pharmacist gives out, they have to go through eligibility of the patient for that medication from about 4 key angles. So is it necessary for the patient? Could we use a non-drug option? And that's actually taught in just regular pharmacy, not just functional medicine. So could we use something that's not a drug? Could we use another medication better, get rid of a side effect and not have to use this? Is it an effective drug for this condition once we've decided that it is necessary? So if it's not the most effective one, is there a more effective one? Are there drug interactions that could make it less effective? Patient-specific sort of stuff. From a safety angle, does this patient have a current disease state that makes it a contraindication to use this drug? So if you have a current heart condition, you might not want to use something that could increase your blood pressure, for example. And then patient-specific factors, again, adherence. Can the patient swallow pills, or are they going to need a liquid formulation, and how does that look? And then, assuming the prescription is appropriate, we have to, of course, counsel you on the medication, and that's something that's well known. Then there's the technical responsibilities, and that's the stuff that you all kind of think about. So making sure that we give out the right medication, that it's labeled properly, and that, of course, it hasn't expired. And then, of course, we get to the billing. So the billing responsibilities that the pharmacist has can again be separated into 2 sort of categories. So there's the mandated things we have to do, and then there's the stuff that pharmacists do that we don't get paid for. So in the government mandated section, ensuring the patient is offered the right medication based on formularies, and that we charge the right amount. That's pretty much all we are mandated to do. Extra stuff we do, and that's because we're nice people most of the time, and also because it's good customer service. And unfortunately, in Canada, a lot of our healthcare is a business, is a retail situation. So explaining to you how the drug coverage works, helping you navigate the various drug plans, liaising with your doctor back and forth. Oh, this isn't covered, we need to get something else. Finding you coupon cards to save you money. And then I wanted to highlight here, billing drugs through private insurance plans is not a mandated thing. So pharmacies do this because it's convenient for patients, and therefore it makes good business sense, but it's a huge headache. And so, you know, we're often on the phone calling your insurance agencies to find out why things aren't covered, explaining all of this stuff. It takes quite a bit of time, and it's not a mandated thing. So that's something that the pharmacy is doing because it makes good business sense and because it's convenient to you. So you as the patient have some responsibilities as well. Be prepared. Show up to the pharmacy with everything you need to get your prescription filled. So you're going to need some identification. Surprising to a lot of people that you need to show up with some identification to get, oh, I don't know, a narcotic medication. Sometimes I wonder how the post office requires more identification than a pharmacy. Your drug coverage cards. Ideally, give that to the pharmacist ahead of time because we have to redo all our work to get it covered if you show up to get the prescription with the card. Refills. If you have a 90-day prescription, try to come to the pharmacy a couple of days before you're going to run out. We have a lot of people throwing a vial down on the counter there on the last day. They've taken their last pill and then they find out they have no refills. And that leads me to my next thing, emergency fills. A last resort, not a regular go-to because you've failed to be organized. Give your pharmacist as much information as possible. So you want your pharmacist to know about as much as your doctor knows. That allows us to assess the prescription adequately. And then be patient, but not a pushover. Understand that in a day, a pharmacist has easily 200 to 300 prescriptions to go through. if you're a patient with us, that ensures we do a really good job and we look at everything from every angle. We will always prioritize antibiotics, anti-anxiety medications, pain medications as they come in. They go to the top of the pile. The caveat to being patient is don't be a pushover. I see it all the time. It's a busy place and people just kind of take no too easily and they don't push for their rights. That happens at the doctor's office and at the pharmacy. So you want to, if you just don't feel like it's right, say something. So now we get to the part that you're all really interested in, the drug coverage. And our previous speaker did go over quite a bit of this. So I'll do the pharmacy specific parts. So you've got 3 primary plan types, the government plans, private plans, and special payment plans. So the government plans, I'll talk about BC. I was hoping that I was going to have someone from Ontario to talk, but unfortunately, pharmacy is in a bit of a state of crisis right now, so it was hard to get someone to sign on. So the government plan in BC is called BC Fair Pharmacare. It's based on income, and they've got these fancy little tables here that you can find on the internet easily to decide what your deductible will be and what your family maximum will be. So your deductible, that's what you have to hit before the government starts paying any money. So you pay full price, including all the dispensing fees, et cetera, until you hit your deductible. And then at that point, the government kicks in for a percentage until you hit your family maximum, and then you pay nothing. Key point, your pharmacist does not have access to your individual deductible. So don't ask your pharmacist what the deductible is. They don't know, because that would mean they know quite a bit about your income. So you'll have to find that out by calling Pharmacare. Then we've got private insurance plans. So you either sign up for those personally or you get them through work. Again, subject to a deductible before the plan will start paying. And not always billed automatically at the pharmacy, as I said. Sometimes that's even just a plan rule. You get a cheaper plan if you don't have it billed directly at the pharmacy. With this, pharmacies will often not bill compounds or specialty products directly to the insurance plans because there's often unfair auditing principles, and it's just not worth it to have to go back to, well, you can't go back to the patient later and ask them for money once they already have the product. So the drugs that are eligible for coverage, a key point is that the family deductible and family maximum only apply to eligible medications. So there are formularies that decide that. And you have to make sure 99% of the time your eligible medications between your private plan and your public plan will be aligned, but not always. So you might spend more in a year than your family maximum to hit it on both plans. So I won't go over this because our previous speaker did, how they decide what drugs are covered, but it's based on a regulatory body's analysis of cost effectiveness. In BC, we have some special programs that try to ensure the plan can continue to cover things as time goes on. So we have the lowest cost alternative program, and that's generally just aimed at making sure generics are given out preferentially to brand names. There are a few exceptions, like covering bulk ointment versus covering tubes of ointment, which is a great way that the government passes on the cost to the pharmacy because we have to buy an ointment tube to put things in. Then within the generic section, there's something in BC called the reference drug program. So that's aimed at getting the lowest cost medication within that scope of generics covered and making people pay the difference if they're on something else. So within the acid blocker class, you've probably heard of Zantac or Pepcid. Zantac or ranitidine is the cheapest one. So they'll pay fully for that and they'll not pay fully for the other ones in that class. Your pharmacist is able to switch you between those medications within that class without contacting the doctor. So that is an option if you want full coverage. If you don't do well on the low cost medication or the RDP, special authority is available. And that's often we're talking about the medications that are within $100 to $300-ish a month. Your doctor will have to fill out a form for coverage. There is no guaranteed acceptance of that, and the speed of approval varies between the drugs and the indications. So some examples, if you have a blood clot and you need a blood thinner, such as apixaban, you would ideally be put on a heparin medication, which is cheaper, but your doctor can apply for this oral medication instead. It's around $300 for 90 days, and you can get up to 6 months of coverage. Now that will be covered pretty quickly. Turnaround time, 1 or 2 days. A chronic example would be for diabetes. We've got something called empagliflozin or Jardiance. That is about $300 for 90 days. And it's not a quick turnaround, because the idea is that your diabetes has been getting worse and worse over time. We check your A1C to figure out what your blood glucose is, and that's a running average at about 90 days. So we're not too worried about getting this covered right away. So it can be 2 weeks to a month to get that covered. Then within BC, we've got special plans, such as the palliative care plan for people who are at the end of their lives, and the psychiatric medications plan, Plan G. So those are fully covered plans. You're not going to pay any deductible. It's just going to be fully covered. Somewhat grim, the palliative care plan, again, taking a nod to the elegance of economics. They're only going to cover 1 month at a time for the medications, because the idea is that they're at the end of their life. So all those plans are on the PharmaCare website to scroll through and understand. If you find this particularly confusing, as many do, there is a great website in BC called drugsearch.ca. So you can just go there, type in the medication, and it will pop up with a list of information on what the cost is, how it's covered, what the cost will be after you reach your deductible, and then what it would be after you hit your family max. And then you can also see in here that the 10 milligram capsules actually cost more per capsule than the 20. So then we come to special plans and coupons. The coupons are usually for brand name drug coverage. So the manufacturer will provide a coupon card promoting patients to use those products instead of the generic. So we often see that with things like Concerta, which is used for ADHD. And it's often when they're pretty new to having a generic available. So then there's the high cost drugs, and those are things that are within $1,000 to $1,500 a month. And even more. Biologics generally is what we're looking at. And these patient support programs will help ensure that a patient is fully covered and able to adhere to the therapy. So some examples are Humira, which is for a variety of autoimmune conditions. It's over $1,000 a month. And it's got a patient support program that helps get patients coverage for the medication. Patients will enroll with it. They'll have a nurse who helps them through all of these things. The medication prescription goes from the patient support program over to the doctor and then to the pharmacy, which is joyous to the pharmacy, because when we get audited, insurance companies love to piggyback on the rules of the college. So the college says the prescription is only valid if it comes straight from a doctor to you. Well, it's now gone through this patient support program. So we've got insurance companies auditing and saying, well, that didn't come straight from a doctor. Please give us our $1,500 back. But that's talk for another day. So then we've got the generics. So this is Hyrimoz, which is the generic version or the biosimilar of Humira. So then the generic company has a patient support program as well. And this one is about $500 a month. So it's much cheaper, but it is still quite expensive. And then we have, like was mentioned previously, compassionate supply. So if the patient has lost a dose or they've hit a family maximum with their private insurance, we can just call up these patient support programs, and they'll either send a compassionate supply, or often they'll just send us a drug card to get it covered within the pharmacy. And of course, the pharmacy is not paid to dispense that medication. We become a depot for people to drop things off, and we just hand them out. So then we come to dealing with your pharmacist in the long term. I just wanted to highlight a few things here about financial health as it pertains to physical health. I think it's important here to take the long view financially, and allow your pharmacist to take their time with filling a chronic medication. As I pointed out earlier, there's a difference between acute and chronic. Your blood pressure is climbing for many, many years before it gets to this stage. So if you're going to be taking a prescription that could likely be for a very long time, you want to know what you're getting into before you start. Some medications are hard to stop once you start them, such as antidepressants. They have to be tapered. Some medications can fix one problem but lead to another problem. So if you're looking at a painkiller, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, such as called an NSAID, so ibuprofen, Advil, naproxen, or Aleve, they can damage your kidneys. They're on a class of medications that is literally called nephrotoxic, kidney toxic. So as a general rule, the harm to your kidney can be much higher than the benefit you're getting from pain control if you're taking those chronically. So you want to really be careful there. If you're now got kidney damage, now you're on dialysis, you've got to take off work to go do that 3 times a week. It's going to be a pretty big hit to your budget. And of course, it's often cheaper all around to make a lifestyle change than to start a medication, because those lifestyle changes are going to impact many facets of your life, whether that's your relationships, your mental health, your physical health, whereas a drug will often only hit one facet and cause a lot of problems in other areas. Oh, there we go. And then for your financial health, you can seek out pharmacist clinical services. So government paid programs are available, such as adaptations to get you into that cheaper drug class, or to make sure you have a better dose for what you need. Medication reviews are available, often government paid, depending on how many medications you're on. And the pharmacist can go over all your medications with you and search out for some problems to talk to your doctor about. And of course, immunizations. So if you're over 65 in BC, you can get your pneumonia shots for free. Then there's private pay consultations that pharmacists will often offer. They are paid out of pocket, often not reimbursed by your insurance, but they can be very valuable in the long term. Remember, optimum disease management will save you money. Thank you.
That was great, Kim. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on now to Ned. Ned Poischik. Ned, I'm not sure if I said that correctly. I'm hoping I did.
Close enough.
Is Green Shield Canada's Vice President of Pharmacy Benefits Management. In this role, he's responsible for overseeing both the strategic and operational elements of GSC Pharmacy Benefits Management and function. On the strategic side, Ned leads a team of pharmacists and drug policy specialists responsible for setting GSC's strategic direction with respect to pharmacy and drug benefits management, including product development and pharmaceutical industry partnerships. On the operational side, Ned's scope of responsibility includes oversight of drug pricing, formulary management, and drug prior authorizations. With an industry background that includes role as Director of Health Policy for the Ontario Pharmacists Association, Ned is a key member of GSC's pharmacy team. Ned holds master's and PhD degrees from the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of Toronto and is currently appointed as the adjunct lecturer within the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. Now, with that said, this part of our webinar is going to be a little different. Blake, Jay, and I came up with predefined questions that Jay is going to facilitate and ask Ned, and then Ned and him will have a discussion. So go ahead, both of you.
Well, thank you very much, Ned, for joining us, and thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction. So I want to start with just saying, from Kevin and from Lindsay, we've heard how complex the whole medication world is. Ned, really, you being the insurance company representative end up being the ones who get blamed when anything goes sideways, when people try to make claims at the pharmacy. They're also not mad, they also get mad at people like Kim. But ultimately, we hear about how the insurance company declined claims. So today we're hoping through this conversation to clear some of that up and give people the tools to give to their clients about how to better help the employees trying to make claims. One of the big things that comes up very regularly, of course, is dealing with special authorization medications. So Ned, if you can speak to what is a special author or prior auth medication and a little bit about what causes a drug to fall into that category, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, thank you guys for the opportunity to be here today and have this dialogue. So when it comes to prior authorization, it's not a new function. Obviously, I think we're all familiar. It's been around for 20 years as a general function. And prior to that time, again, this came into the context with the introduction of ever more costly medications. Prior to that time, every drug would have been what we call a general benefit, right? The idea is if you have a prescription, you go to the pharmacy, unless you failed some particular rules in the system, such as you refilled it just a day ago or something, the claim should pass and you should be able to get your medication. Prior authorization was another layer of assessment, if you will, that was introduced into the process really when we start to see the emergence of some of these ultra high cost medications. And so the idea behind prior authorization, I mean, it's fairly simple, as the name implies. It's that you can't just go to the pharmacy and fill a $100,000, $500,000 prescription. There needs to be a greater level of oversight over that particular prescription. Now, even as I'm saying that, I can imagine that for a lot of people in the system, that gets very challenging because it's like, what do you mean oversight, right? And it gets into very philosophical kinds of debates around, well, like, who are you, the insurance company, to intervene between me and my doctor who said I need this, right? So that's the philosophical kind of dilemma. So I think from an insurance company perspective, and certainly from our employers, the clients and advisors and everybody, the idea is that it's not necessarily about a mechanism to slow down access to therapy. It's not a mechanism to deny things. It's a mechanism to ensure that if the medication is being prescribed, that it is being used in the most appropriate context, right? So what I mean by that is that it doesn't mean that we can't necessarily start with the premise that all prescribing is rational. Because if that was the case, there really wouldn't be a need for prior authorization, right? You would simply assume that whatever the physician prescribed is appropriate, and what's the problem, right? What we see through prior authorization, of course, is that yes, vast majority of prescribing is absolutely rational. It absolutely does follow clinical practice guidelines. It absolutely does meet, the clinical criteria. But where it gets a little bit more nuanced, obviously, is in situations where, the evidence may not be as supportive, for example, for a particular condition. Maybe the evidence isn't there. But you can imagine a physician may want to try that treatment, and you can't blame them. They're advocating for their patients and wanting for their patients to get access to therapy. But it doesn't necessarily mean it meets the bar for what is valued in terms of being, from again, employer perspective, is worth paying for, if you will, right? So, and that bar is a difficult one to set, right? It's often very challenging. And of course, there's other elements of where prior authorization fits in. For example, off-label prescribing. Many, insurance companies don't pay for off-label prescribing. And by off-label, I mean, it's not actually approved by Health Canada for that particular indication. But the physician, there may be some early evidence emerging that maybe works here or there. So most insurance companies will not pay for off-label prescribing because it's considered in many cases experimental, right? So lots of context, lots of situations where prior authorization does fit in. And to give you kind of a bit of a perspective of the approval versus denial rate, typically, if you sum up all your prior authorizations in any given year, you'd look at a denial rate somewhere in the 25 to 30% rate, meaning that 70% are approved, 75% are approved, 25% are denied on the basis of not enough evidence, not enough support for that particular condition, for that particular patient. Maybe I'll pause there.
But okay, so that's that's really interesting. So when we think about the special auth as to what you're talking about, you talked about drugs over $100,000. Special authorization happens quite frequently for drugs that are a lot less than that, does it not?
It does. It does. I mean, typically it starts at the level of 10,000 per patient per year. That kind of threshold is often considered specialty. That's what's anything above that is considered specialty, and then typically invokes prior authorization.
I've also seen situations where prior authorization has caught situations where the medication was completely not appropriate. How do you guys work if you guys find that situation to go back to either the pharmacist, the patient, or the doctor to try and have enhance the conversation?
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? Because this is where I think a prior authorization becomes more than a cost management mechanism. It becomes a safety mechanism as well, right? And again, whether the physician would willingly prescribe something that they, felt may work for the patient, but may have been a safety issue, or may just simply made a mistake. Either way, which doesn't necessarily happen often. I don't want to portray this as happening often. Uh, it's a great mechanism, an additional layer of checking, right? And remember, though, that we do have community pharmacies act as yet another check, right? They're often the last line of defense. So remember that, when it comes to most prior authorization departments in most insurance companies, including ours, they're staffed by pharmacists. So you're really getting almost like another pharmacist input into the prescribing process, right? And before it passes this gate, it will then go down to the community pharmacy, is yet another gate where, it has to pass that safety. And that's a good thing, right? We want multiple eyes, especially on complex specialty biologic drugs.
Well, the reality of what I understand special auth to be is it protects the patient, it protects the employer, it protects so many people in the different chain. These are not inexpensive medications, and most of these medications do have massive side effects. So more eyes, the better, right?
Absolutely.
Typically, does it get to a point where a drug has had special auth process and then eventually falls off, or once special auth, always special auth?
Not necessarily, right? So there's a dynamic mechanism behind special auth in the sense that it should be a living mechanism, right? The idea here is that not to place it and set it and forget it onto prior authorization. The idea is to continuously evaluate whether prior authorization makes sense, right? And there's a couple of different ways to look at that, right? So there's certainly more of a qualitative look in terms of what we're getting, and the sort of the right, is it the right indication? Is it being prescribed in appropriate context? And then there's also just the sheer denial and approval rates, right? So if you're approving 95% of all prior authorizations, then you could argue there's very little merit in continuing to create a barrier there, right? And this does happen for certain conditions. And in that context, it needs to really be reconsidered whether continued placement of prior authorization is even warranted at all, right? So yeah, it should be a dynamic process. It is a dynamic process, certainly for us at Green Shield, and it needs to live that way.
So that's interesting. Earlier you said that around 25 to 30% of PA applications are denied, and you spoke to the idea that 95% means that they might start to fall off. How do things change to move from that 30 to 95%? Is it like, what type of training programs do you guys have going on in the background?
I mean, I think that's really just more of a function of each therapeutic category and each drug in question, right? So you've got certain drugs that are broadly indicated across different conditions, sometimes in mild to moderate disease. Sometimes they're just for moderate to severe disease. And then you have other drugs, for example, that are so clear cut. Like if you have this genetic mutation and you've got this condition and then it's indicated, right? In that context, you're not likely to see huge amounts of over prescribing, like, because the therapy isn't going to necessarily be helpful, because if you don't have the mutation, why would you be prescribing that drug? But if you think about some of the drugs that commonly prescribe biologic drugs, let me take an example of a drug like Actemra. We just found out during the COVID crisis that it's actually effective against COVID, right? So severe COVID cases. So some of these drugs have very broad, and they don't necessarily have broad indication, but they have broad utilization. They do things in the body that can be used to treat many different conditions, quite frankly, right? So that's when you start to see prescribing become a little more liberal, right? and physicians use it like a tool in a novel condition where they're saying, well, I can see, first of all, there's usually case reports and things like that they look at, but I can see how the mechanism of action here to reduce, let's say, inflammation can equally work in another setting where I've got inflammation from a completely different condition, right? So that's really, it's really just a question of therapeutic category, the broad nature of the drug, in which how it can be used, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the types of prescribers being the ones to prescribe it, all kinds of conditions, right?
Well, that speaks to the complete complexity that goes on in the background, because you take a drug that wasn't meant for something and somehow somebody realizes it's meant for something, and the insurance companies have to keep up with all of that, as does the PA system and the retail pharmacy level. That's brutal. So moving away from special auth, when new medications are created, are they automatically added at most insurance companies on your average formulary, or what kind of efficacy rate are insurers typically looking for before they'll cover them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the review process for drug therapies in the private industry has become a lot more sophisticated, more rigorous over the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years. Again, commensurate with the growth of high-cost specialty and all those kinds of drugs. Historically, the private insurance has always had a much more liberal, process in terms of the number of drugs that are listed on formulas compared to public drug plans, right? So just as a sheer order of magnitude, something like Ontario Drug Benefit Program here in Ontario has about 4,500 different DINs, or I'm not gonna use the word drugs because one drug can have multiple DINs, right? Whereas a typical private insurance plan might have 9,000 DINs on its plan. So a lot more liberal, lot more drugs make the cut. And that's just the nature of how historically private plans have always been structured. But the scrutiny level has increased recently, and there's been more attention paid to really looking at, the efficacy of therapies, the cost effectiveness of therapies, and all those kinds of elements. The HTA evidence, looking at, the effectiveness of drugs, etc. By HTA, I mean health technology assessment. So,
Thank you.
organizations like CADITH and others that do this work. So yeah, the efficacy, you can't cleanly establish a threshold to say this is the level of efficacy. It's more art than science, right? I mean, it's both. But it varies, right? And we take kind of multiple perspectives. We look at the efficacy, the safety, the cost, the unmet need, and we also try to understand the employer's perspective in this process, right? So, is this the 16th drug coming to market to treat RA, and is the unmet need necessarily not really there? Or is it something like a novel treatment to treat migraines, which are a problem, right, for employers in terms of either disability or in some cases absenteeism. So we have to try to really kind of holistically look at all those things, understand what our employers would ultimately want, what they're hoping to achieve, and then make those kinds of decisions. But it's a rigorous process. It goes through multiple stages of review and evaluation.
Yeah, it's a really tough balance. Those of us on the advisory side, we're constantly having to explain why the prices are going up. And on your end, you're thinking about, we want to get client covered, and at the same time, we want to make sure the plans are long-term sustainable, right?
Exactly.
So, okay, so talking about all that with high-cost drugs and everything else that you're thinking about, when a claim comes in for a high-cost drug, what is actually going on in the background in the insurance company in terms of trying to ensure that it's properly covered?
So I mean, typically, yeah, it's a good question. So I mean, typically the process always starts with prior authorization, right? So typically you would not get a claim for a high cost drug. You start with prior authorization. As the prior authorization, goes through, and let's assume that it's approved, then it's a kind of like a series of different steps, and it depends really on client choice, right? So vast majority of clients, for example, in our case, have like a specialty drug preferred pharmacy network on their plan. So the drug isn't dispensed anywhere. It's dispensed typically through a select group of pharmacies that are part of that network. That network has a number of value-added services that are kind of coupled around that particular patient that is going through it, that it creates more of a tighter case management around the patient, right? So you may have, depending on what each plan sponsor adopts, you may have things like, ongoing case management of that patient. So, check-ins at certain periodic intervals to see how the drug is working for that patient. You will have some additional value-added services like adherence support for those patients, particularly for the ones who choose to have that service. Not everybody needs it, right? And so there's a bit of a more management of the patient post the approval, right? In the cases where plan sponsors who don't want that particular product, then it's kind of a more of a traditional pathway. They get approved for prior authorization, they receive that approval, they can fill wherever they wish, whatever the process is that they currently follow, and we really are hands off. We're saying the claim is paid on an ongoing basis. The only additional layer of oversight that may exist is for certain drugs, not all, there may be a reevaluation at a certain periodic intervals. So, for example, yes, you're approved for the drug today, but in a year's time, 6 months, depending on the clinical situation, we will seek for a reauthorization to see that you've met certain clinical parameters that are suggestive that the drug is indeed working for you. So, if we take an example of something like cystic fibrosis, we would like to see that you starting this particular treatment has resulted in an improvement in your, pulmonary function, or at least stabilization of your pulmonary function. We'd like to see that, the rate of hospitalizations due to your condition has declined, as per seen in clinical trials. So the idea is that you need some level of evidence to show that the drug is indeed working for you the way it should, and that feels logical as a bit of a checkpoint. Again, not to introduce additional barriers, but to create proper oversights over what our plan sponsors would want us to, or they'd like us to do.
It's awesome. You mentioned RA. My understanding with autoimmune type issues is sometimes if they're caught early, the high cost biologic drugs can actually reverse in certain cases. Yet we know that with a lot of autoimmune, or as far as I understand, with a lot of autoimmune, as the body adapts, the drug no longer works for them. So if you initially get a request for a high cost biologic drug with somebody who's just been diagnosed, is that typically allowed, or do pharmacy or insurance companies in general try and push people to I'll call them the starter medications, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jay. And I mean, I think that one that the answer to that changes over time, right? So at the moment, if we just focus on RA, and this is true for other conditions as well, but if we focus on RA specifically, biologics are not the first line treatment, right? They're not. You do have some traditional therapies like methotrexate and others that are considered to be the first line treatment in this case, right? And clinical guidelines are aligned with that, right? So it's not, we're not inventing this step therapy, we're following clinical guidelines. And that's quite frankly what a lot of prior authorization is enforcement of clinical guidelines. Not always, but a lot of it can be that. So, in that case, so you could argue, as the evidence mounts with the usage of biologics in kind of as a primary starting treatment, you could argue that we might get to a place where that might be the case. There's going to be significant cost implications of that, of course. But again, if that's where the evidence points that long-term prognosis and long-term outcomes are better, then the clinical guidelines will likely follow, and then we'll have to make decisions around, is this affordable? Is it sustainable? And if it is, then we should go there, right? But it's a moving target, right? Even in cancer, as another example, historically it was always chemotherapy. You start with chemotherapy, and chemotherapy is not great. It's you're blasting the body with and poisoning it, in effect, poisoning the cancer and trying to, and making sure to do as minimal damage as you can to the rest of the body, but it's never that specific. Now you've got cancer targeted therapies that are just for that cancer. They're not poisoning the rest of the body. But those targeted therapies in many cases are still not first-line treatments. Chemotherapy is still the first line, and this becomes a second line. But as the evidence mounts, we may get to a place where we'll just displace chemo, and same goes for RA and other conditions.
That's super interesting. I didn't know that was going on in the cancer world. I guess just one more space that we need to be watching. So keeping in this concept of the high cost issues, are there any provinces that deal better with integrating coverage for high cost than others? And how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I think we all know, and Kevin pointed out a little bit earlier, it's a bit of a Wild West, right? So every province has its own combination of programs, its own eligibility requirements, its own deductibles, its own copays, and all those kinds of elements. I mean, I think that probably maybe the universal standard for integration between public and private plans it would be in BC, British Columbia, partly because a couple of different things, right? So BC's done some things very right in the sense of having a one PharmaNet system, for example, where every prescription is recorded, right? So pharmacists, for example, have a full inventory of everything you're on, regardless of where you filled it. But furthermore, further than that, because everything goes through PharmaNet, and it's a PharmaCare province, every prescription is also sent to PharmaCare first. So it's pretty seamless in the sense that, I mean, for the most part, where you're not necessarily having to invoke new processes and new structures and change the order of payers. You're always submitting prescriptions to PharmaCare. The question is, when do you satisfy the deductible to ultimately have them become the primary payer? But it's good in the sense that the system is set up and it's running in a way that makes that a lot easier. Recent developments, for example, with having pharmacies access to these BCSA codes, which indicate whether a patient's been approved for a high-cost drug by the province, are also creating an additional kind of seamless, journey through the process, or more seamless journey through the process. Now let's compare that against Ontario, where you've got a much more complex process in place. You're either a member of one of the provincial drug plans like ODB, or you have to apply through a program like Trillium. But Trillium is massively complex, right? You've got quarterly deductibles, you've got all of those kinds of elements. So it's there's a lot more administrative elements. It's not that it shouldn't be done, not that it's impossible. And certainly we do it to a great degree. But again, differences, right? So so to answer your question directly, I'd say BC's program is probably closest to what could be considered a more seamless experience.
So, and that's very interesting because actually living in BC, having most of my clients in BC, we find that the communication about people needing to be on PharmaCare just isn't there. Most people don't even really know that it exists. If there's anybody here who advises in BC, I highly recommend you do a PharmaCare registration education session for your employments, to Ned's point. So you mentioned Trillium. My understanding in Ontario is that Trillium should kick in similarly to what happens here in BC, where you just get a decline if you haven't shown your PharmaCare card eventually, but that doesn't really happen. Can you speak to that at all? And that's just my understanding. I'm not licensed in Ontario.
So Trillium is again a little bit more complex, right? So I guess the fundamental difference with Trillium and where the administration of Trillium comes into play is there's this piece around having to satisfy an out-of-pocket deductible, right? So in BC, for example, the provincial drug plan does not care who pays for your drugs in the initial deductible phase. They just care that you reach a certain threshold of spending. Once you reach a certain threshold of spending, you now meet the criteria for provincial PharmaCare program. In Ontario, there's a similar requirement. You have to have a certain amount of spending, but that spending cannot be paid for by another plan. It has to be you literally reaching into your pocket and paying that much. And that is roughly 4% of your net income. So now let's take that. So somebody making $100,000 a year net means that that means $4,000 they'd have to pay out of pocket before Trillium becomes an option for them, right? So for certain individuals, they may meet that deductible a lot sooner, right? So somebody making $30,000, as you can imagine, prorate that, you're looking at over $1,500 or something like that out of pocket spending. But that's not often very helpful, right? So somebody making $100,000 a year, living in Ontario and Toronto, real estate prices, all these things, having to pay $4,000 out of pocket will be a pretty significant burden, right? And it doesn't give you that security you need that you have the first dollar coverage, that it's sitting there for. It's like, I must spend this amount of money out of pocket, then my coverage will kick in, and that is assessed on a quarterly basis. So you could take that 4,000 as an example and break it down to quarters. So it would be 1,000 per quarter, and the idea is Trillium will kick in and out, right? The idea is you could be eligible for Trillium one quarter and then not eligible for next quarter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it gets complicated, and the administration is complicated, and it's also messy between the switch with the public and the private, right? The pharmacies have to continue to make sure that they're switching the order of billing and that the right billing is going to the right direction and all those elements. So, but I will say though, like Trillium is still sort of this mystery thing that's not well understood. And you mentioned pharmacare is not well understood at BC. Trillium is even way less understood, right? People don't even know that Trillium exists, that you could apply for, that you do have some catastrophic coverage through that program. That exists there. So now, one thing I have seen, and this is something we have to really be careful with, is I've seen increasing kind of abuse of Trillium, right? So I've seen situations where there's a fair bit of patients that will not declare that the 4,000 or 1,000, whatever, is was not in fact paid out of pocket, but it may have been paid, let's say, by a pharmaceutical company in the form of copay assistance, may have been paid for by healthcare spending account, whatever the case may be. Technically speaking, that is illegal, and the patient has to declare that and has to have spent the money out of pocket to qualify. But no one reports this back, quite frankly, and many patients get on Trillium having not paid for out of pocket, but paid through another third-party source, whatever that may be. It's a dangerous practice, I would argue, and one that sets a bad precedent, I would think, from an insurance company perspective. So we certainly don't endorse those kinds of practices.
Meanwhile, you take your average person making $30,000 to $50,000 a year, especially in a place like Toronto, you can't afford that $1,200 to $1,500 deductible. Put them on an 80-20 plan, staying mum is better than the alternative. It's less cost. That is really brutal. So with all that in mind, what types of things that the various carriers are doing to help claimants manage all of these costs?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the other flip side. The important part of the equation, right, is that we've got a responsibility for our patients and a responsibility to our employers in equal fashion, right? We can't just subject our patients to these processes and leave them at that, right? So it's incumbent upon us to provide as much guidance, support, alternatives, whatever the case may be, as we engage in this process, right? I mean, I think that most insurance companies have done a really great job of creating kind of an effective cost management toolkit, right? Which consists of your typical elements that we're all familiar with, right? So prior authorization, you'll have some combination of either biosimilar strategies or PLAs on the originators. You'll have some PLAs on non-originator molecules, things like that bring down costs, and some navigation often, right, in the form of coordination with provincial programs. I mean, I think those programs work very well and work very effectively at sort of managing costs overall, trying to create a good patient journey. More technology needs to be introduced into this process, I think. We're still a little bit behind, but we're starting to see some glimmers of, new technological innovation in this space. So things like, for example, once you apply for prior authorization today, it's still a paper-based process. No one knows where the status is. And so people call in, it's three-way calls, it's all these things. We're starting to see movement towards more electronic mechanisms of prior authorization, more trackers where people can see real time what's happening. We know that both the BC Pharmacare and in Ontario with the program called SADI that they've introduced, there's more, this electronic prior authorization is starting to take over and become more common. So these are welcome things that will enhance the patient experiences they're going through this process, decrease some of the nervousness around, what is happening with my application, speed up approval times, or at least, response times. So I'd argue the combination of those things is going to be important as we go forward.
Ned, I would love to continue this conversation. We probably could have just talked for a full hour. As we, if we had started questioning Kevin and Kim about as well. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you so much
today.
Appreciate
and
being here.
Please stay on the line for Q&A after. Lindsay?
Thanks, Jay. So our last speaker today, but certainly not least, is Sandy Savo. Sandy is a trilingual techno sales professional with over 18 years of experience specializing in relationship management, business development, sales, marketing, and training. She holds a BA in insurance, master's in marketing and communication from the ESCP Business School in Paris, and other insurance licenses, the LLQP, FLMI, and PCS from LOMA, the Life Office Management Association. Sandy is self-motivated, dynamic, and agile, with a proven record of implementing and executing successful sales strategies in international markets. With ClaimSecure, she currently manages national sales of brokerages and consulting houses since September 2020, supporting their businesses, strategies, designing unique product offerings, and tailoring solutions to ensure successful and sustainable business models. Please go ahead, Sandy.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by sharing my screen and we can go ahead. Are you able to see?
Yes, we can. Go
We're
ahead.
good.
You're able to see my screen? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks again for everyone who has joined us on this call. Before we dive deeper in the management of high-cost drugs, if you allow me to quickly introduce my organization, as this will help you as well understanding the offering and how you can have access to it. ClaimSecure has been in the market for over 40 years. We've been known to be a boutique organization or a TPP, third-party payer. We've been handling claims adjudication on behalf of third-party administrator, third-party payers, known as TPP, TPAs. We've adjudicated as well claims for insurers. And we definitely deal with manufacturers, as most of you are aware. Over the recent years, we've opened our doors as well for brokers, consultants, and advisors to place their ASO business directly with ClaimSecure when the group is 25 lives and above. Let's start our discussion by looking at the clinical programs currently available in the Canadian market. I know for those who have been in the market for some time are really familiar with those three products: mandatory generic, prior authorization, and governmental plan. I would say fairly those are really more or less the same among all carriers. So they're pretty straightforward, they're identical, and the saving margin as well is pretty much the same among all of us, insurers as well as carriers. But you all know that those programs are really intended to evolve over time to really keep up with the new DINs that are being offered in the market. When we move to the fourth and the fifth program, being the Managed Formulary and the Formulary Select, this is where you start seeing the differentiation in the offering between carriers, because not all of us are using the same listing. And by having different listing, for sure, the margins of the savings would differ between a plan and another. That leads us to our sixth and last clinical program, Formulary Protect and the Formulary Protect Plus. Those two are unique to ClaimSecure when you decide to come and place your business with us directly, but they are also available via our partners. I will just quickly name few: BBD, who's part of our call today, who offer as us the offering on the ASO side, and we have other partners such as Group Health and Group Source who offer those solutions on the fully insured program. I know that some of you are more focused on the fully insured, and some others may be looking at the ASO occasionally. Know that those two solutions are available in the insured world as well as the ASO. Before we go further into the definitions, I would like to share with you a few statistics that I was able to pull out from the Government of Canada site. According to the site, as of end of 2019, we've had over 1.2 million small businesses, i.e. companies that are ranging between 1 and 99 employees. 22,900 companies are considered to be medium, and only 2,978 were judged as large corporations, i.e. above 500 lives. So according to the website again, as of end of 2020, we had over 88% of businesses considered small to medium. I really want you to keep that in mind because that will help you as well going through the discussion further on. This is a very important slide for you to really understand the evolution of the specialty drugs. As you can see, and for those who have been in the market for some time, I know you would be, again, smiling and remembering the old days in 2005, where we used to have stop loss offered for $2.5, $5,000, and even $7,000 in comparison to 2019, 20, and 2021, where carriers not only have stopped offering those limits, but have put a threshold, a minimum threshold of $10,000, if not $15,000 on the stop loss pooling. That really has a direct connection to the evolution of the drugs because we have more and more DINs coming. They are treating much more conditions in comparison to 2005, and by default, their cost as well is increasing. So really everything goes together, more DINs, more exposure. That definitely has a direct impact on the profitability and on the claims experience of your group, regardless of whether they are in the ASO world or the fully insured. When we look at the solution being the Formulary Protect as well as the Formulary Protect Plus, it's really all around the specialty drugs, high cost drugs. Our definition is always around medication that could be costing over $10,000 and above annually. So when we go and select those programs, it's really a selection, it's a plan design selection where we say any medication above $10,000 is automatically excluded from the program. So we are removing it from the program by default. Before we go into the comparison between Formulary Protect and the Plus, I really want you to keep an open mind to those solutions and think of 3 or 4 types of clients for the sake of this explanation. I want you to remember how many groups as of date are still having drug caps on their plans, regardless really of the reasons. And we know very well that when you have a drug cap, it's really a message loud and clear that the plan sponsor is not able to cover the specialty drugs. That has been really the main reason why we have still drug caps on the programs. Remember as well all the clients that have a copay of 20% on the drugs on their programs, and those who come and tell you we are struggling with specialty drugs on our plans, please find us a solution on the long term. It is really understandable that advisors and consultants have always the luxury and the flexibility to look for new carriers and to look for new insurers that would be willing to take your risks if it wasn't profitable for a reason or another in a certain year. But we need to remember that the claims experience is not really like the accidental claims that can come as a shock claim one shot, one time. Even when you are considering new carriers, the claims experience is going to the client. And on the longer term, if this is really not addressed, your risk can become uninsurable. We have seen 2 to 3 large group last year having a lot of carriers rejecting their quotes because of the claims experience and because of them having a significant count of specialty drugs on their programs. So please, as we go through these slides, just keep those kind of clients in your mind, because that will help you better understanding how those could really be fitting certain groups in comparison to the others. Normally, when I present that slide and when I define what Formulary Protect is in comparison to the Formulary Protect Plus, I know a lot of you disconnect or disqualify by default Formulary Protect over the Plus. I'll try to give you some examples or where we really believe Formulary Protect is a great fit or could be of a great fit in comparison to the Formulary Protect Plus. I'll start with what is common between the two, and then we see how they differentiate from one another. So both will continue to cover any standard prescription drugs, whether it's traditional or value, i.e. below $10,000. So these are the two here. Both will not be covering any specialty drugs when it is on the provincial or the governmental drug formularies. So both are, again, identical. When the specialty drug is not on the provincial or the governmental drug formularies, the Formulary Protect will continue not covering it, so it will remain excluded. In comparison to the Formulary Protect Plus, should the drug not be listed on the provincial or governmental, and after proving that all other alternative has been tested and failed, and the condition is meeting the clinical criteria of claim secure, there is a chance for the medication to come back to the plan. Again, I know that some, by having this understanding, would maybe prefer to suggest or recommend the Formulary Protect Plus to the client over the Formulary Protect, thinking that you are giving them more protection or more assurance, if I may say. But I'll give you a simple example of when Formulary Protect could really be of a great fit for certain clients. Remember, those who have a drug cap. Imagine a client with a drug cap of $5,000, or let's go even higher to $15,000. When you are exposed to a specialty drug, even a $20,000 cap or a $15,000 cap will not really be enough to be really supporting the annual consumption of that medication. What you need to know is the risks that the member is really running when that limit is exhausted. Not only the member are left on their own when that limit is exhausted, even if it's 20,000, but the member is exposed to pay 100% out of pocket the medication cost for up to 90 days until the provincial coverage is granted, because they need to fulfill the waiting period until the switch starts. So the member has been on their own, having to go to all the processes of the province by themselves, on top of definitely having to pay the deductible and the copay according to the provincial requirements, but they are also having to pay the total out-of-pocket costs for up to 90 days themselves. So this is really the first thing I want you to think of. Having or suggesting a Formulary Protect to a client that has a drug cap is really in the best interest of the member and definitely to the best interest of the plan sponsor by default. And you need to know as well that when the provincial approval is granted, that is really going beyond the employment. So whether you lose your job or whether you are really switching from an employer to another, when we are having the alternative funding via the province, that is really a much more security and guarantee for the employee that they will never be forced to pay that payment totally out of pocket. So these two reasons I always try to elaborate further during our discussion on why we believe both products are important, because really each and every product responds to a different profile of clients. So it all depends on the size of the client, on the needs of the client, how far they're able to bring those medication back to the plan, should they come under the Formulary Protect Plus, and definitely depending on the province is how we judge what product to suggest over the other. What's also important that you really have a good understanding of what those products are. We are always here to help you and train you beyond this session as well if need be. It's important that you understand it. It's important as well that you believe in it, because personally I'm very passionate about it, and I know that a lot of speakers and listeners today are also passionate about this product, because when you try it and you see that it works, that will really give you a good comfort level that you are retaining your clients on the long term. So for us, it's important that you understand it, that you are really believing in it, so that you help your clients taking this informative decision on whether this is a good fit or not. So to go back to the definition and the comparison, as we've said, we do have, and this is really a fact, we will always have medication that are not yet covered by the provincial or governmental for the simple reason of them, for example, being new. Let's take a look together of the specialty drugs that are not covered by any province as of today. That list is always subject to change. And I know most of you are aware of that fact, because we have a lot of medication that can be newly presented and some can be discontinued. As of today, we have 7. 5 of them, although they are not covered by the province, but they do have other alternatives funded by the provinces. So again, you don't need to be under the Formulary Protect Plus to having the access to those alternatives, even if you are in the Formulary Protect, and it happened that those specific DINs are not covered, they all have other alternatives that are funded by the province, and we will be able to secure that for your members. The only 2 medications that are not on the provincial so far are only two. These are the two that I'm going around. Those are the only ones that are not covered by the provinces. They don't have alternative funding treatment, and by default, if we are in the Formulary Protect Plus, it might go back to the plan if the clinical criteria are met. I want to as well tell you two updates. Dupixent, which was on our list last year for those who have attended CGIB session, Dupixent is no longer on that list because it has recently gained access in Canada across provinces, while another medication called Xylaflex, and apology if I'm pronouncing them incorrectly, Xylaflex has been discontinued, for example, from the Canadian market. So that list really is always subject to change. We always see new DINs, we see DINs that are gaining access, and sometimes some medication is really being discontinued. Our aim and goal, as all other speakers said earlier, is to ensure that the medication we are approving is the most cost-effective and cost-efficient.
We're almost.
Let's look quickly.
I was going to say, if we can just jump to the navigation services, because we're almost.
Sorry?
Yeah, if we can just jump to the navigation, you got about 3 minutes left.
Yes. No problem. So when we look at the coverage navigation, it's really a concierge service that we are providing. It's an end-to-end support to members specifically. And we always look into 3 alternative funding means: the provincial, the spousal, and the manufacturer. Those 3 sometimes go in silos, but sometimes they work in coordination, depending on the province, the regulation, and the rules, for sure. So it is really a concierge service that we provide to members. How it works. There are 2 ways to approach the support to members. When the policy is newly enrolled into the program, we know the claims experience, we are aware of the experience, and we identify members who are currently under those programs. So the clinical team, the dedicated team, will be engaging with the member proactively, welcoming them to the plan, explaining the package, explaining the process, and we stay with the member until the switch happens and when it is successful. However, as you know, we might have new conditions for existing members or even a new enrollee, and that could arise at any time during the policy year. For the new conditions that arise, the turnaround time could be up to 90 days. We always refer to a bracket up to 90 days, just because the alternative mean that we choose may have a different turnaround time over others. The private ward, for example, is definitely faster than the governmental, and even when we reach out to the province, the turnaround time would differ on whether the case is life-threatening or non-life-threatening. What is always sure is that we really handhold the member from the moment of the initiation until the decision is made. We have the member taking the decisions on which alternative funding to choose, where to register, depending on what's in it for them and where they can have the most benefits. In a nutshell, and for those who are visual, I always like to share that screen because it really helps you seeing the flow and how we go from a step to another. Whenever the claim is a specialty type, we definitely prioritize the spousal coverage first if the person has a partner or is legally married, because definitely that would be the fastest. If the person happened to be single and the drug is on the provincial formulary, we activate the process with the hope to have it secured and have the switch on day 91. If it happened that it's not, then we reach out to the PAP. The manufacturer, the patient assistance program, or the manufacturer support, as we said earlier, it works sometimes in silo and it works sometimes in coordination with the province as well as the spousal coverage. My apology, I forgot to mention one important thing. For the members who are existent to the plan, as we said, and whom we really identified from the start, are always grandfathered for up to 90 days, which means we allow them to continue having the same medication they're used to before joining us up to 90 days, and we make the switch to the alternative funding on day 91. In comparison to the new conditions that we have referred to here, they can take up to 90 days depending on the complexity and the alternative funding that we have chosen. We've always asked the question, does it work? Yes or no? It works. It's not absolute, but it works. We've been doing this for almost 6 years now. We have seen a significant increase of 30% of policy count and 30% increase in population members joining those plans, whether from via Claim Secure directly or via our partners. We have managed over 1,358 cases until August 2021. The success ratio has been, for both Formulary Protect and the Plus combined, 95.73%. I am always asked, why do we still have failure? It's normal because the failure is coming from two main reasons. It's either failure because the DIN is still new and hasn't been added to the formularies yet, or the second main rejection is that the DIN is prescribed, but the clinical criteria are not met. So yes, the DIN is on the listing, but it is not for the clinical criteria that the member has. Quickly, I can assure you as well that we've started running surveys. We're collecting feedback and surveys from members just to ensure that they are happy by the end of that journey. And we are starting to share those feedback very objectively through our session. And we can go into more insight and details with the brokers and consultants and the carriers who are having those programs as well. Active. We're also collecting feedback from brokers, TPAs, consultants, and insurers who are selling it to see, is it working, and really what's best about that product. All of them are happy because it's allowing the plan sponsor to really generate saving, and definitely for the advisor and the consultant to increase their retention on the longer term. What I also provide you from the sales standpoint is always saving illustrations that you can demonstrate and share openly with your clients, because remember, you're not only saving the cost of those high medication, but you're also saving the ASO fees. You're getting a discount on the stop loss that could range from 15% to 35%, depending on what you choose, Protect Formulary over Formulary Protect Plus. And you are also saving premiums on the stop loss because those cost drugs are not hitting the plan no more.
Sandy, I'm going to have to
be as fast as
I'm going to have to stop you there because we've got lots of questions. But that said, anybody that's interested or wants to see more or hear from Sandy about Protect or Protect Plus, get in touch with us at NGBM or Sandy direct, or if you're part of CGIB, and we can get you any answers you need or things set up to chat with her. So thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Ned, Kevin, Kim. This was fantastic. There are some questions that have come in, and I'm going to start with Kevin. Kevin, your first question, do you see employers benefiting from Trillium integration anytime soon, rather than only the employee benefiting?
Well, I'm not sure I'm taking in the question, so I may frustrate who asked it. I think Ned really summed it up with Trillium. I think there is the opportunity for integration. This is a personal comment. I think that I really think that the burden that's placed on the patient is going to deter utilization of Trillium. And I think that's, really, I guess, if you want to say, is there integration between Trillium and private insurance plans? No, there really isn't. So I'd argue for some modernization. Perfect, thank you.
Can I jump in really quick?
Sure.
Really quick. So we got really close to it and the Ontario government then squashed it, but technology-wise, it was all being done at point of sale. We're coming up to another provincial election. Do you think that could be back on the table again? Because small businesses never needed the help more now than ever.
Yeah, Dave, I've heard you speak about this, and I don't disagree with your position. Is it going to get on the table because of a provincial election? I think with the climate that we're in as we roll up to a June election, I don't think this is going to be a tabled item. Maybe something to pursue after the election.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. And this question is for Ned, Kevin, and Kim, so all three of you. What impact does the financial benefit some doctors receive for prescribing specific drugs have on our healthcare system? Kim, did you want to go first, or Ned?
I'm happy to jump. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead,
Kim. Well, I mean, I would say that doctors are not supposed to necessarily have a financial incentive for giving out certain drugs. They definitely don't have a transparent version of that. They are visited often by drug representatives and given education sessions on what drugs to prescribe. So yeah, I would say it probably drives the cost up, but like Ned mentioned, we do have these great prior authorization programs in place, and we do have a pharmacist to catch errors when they present. And there is often academic detailing services put on by pharmacists who are unbiased, who go and do sort of counter educational sessions to doctors. So that helps quite a bit.
Thanks, Kim. Ned, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, and Kevin would probably know this much better, but there's no direct mechanism by which any physician in this country should ever be paid for a prescription for a particular drug. Like, that is blatantly illegal, goes against, I think, the codes of, that IMC and Innovative Medicines Canada and individual companies would have in place against those kinds of practices, right? So, I mean, if that actually existed, where somebody was counting prescriptions for a drug and was paid for those prescriptions, that would be a pretty big scandal, right? So I think there's just a misconception about that this happens routinely. It's softer, as Kim mentioned. It's a lot softer than that. There's detailing. Yes, there's those elements that occur. But are those necessarily bad? I mean, physicians need to find ways to learn about new drugs. This is a mechanism for them to learn. It's not inherently a bad thing. Could it lead to more prescribing or more costlier drugs? Potentially, yeah. So we need counterbalancing forces. We need multiple inputs. We need information that physicians can get from multiple sources. But the presence of pharmaceutical representatives isn't necessarily itself a terrible thing that drives up costs on its own. I think we need to be nuanced in that perspective from multiple ways.
I mean, I think we also do have to recognize that physicians earn advisory board, monies from pharma and stuff. I mean, it's not like, I think there's two sides. There's both. And physicians have to be high prescribers in order to sit on advisory boards, right? So.
Well, I'm feeling like I am the elephant in the room right now.
Sorry, Kevin.
A message from the elephant. There's been no lack of examples, and some of it's sensational. I would say the majority of it is not from Canada. And I can certainly speak from, the experience at J&J. And keep in mind, not all of the pharmaceutical manufacturers are a member of our industry group, Innovative Medicines Canada, and they have set standards. The healthcare compliance component of our organization has really grown over time, and it is, listen, folks, everything down to if we're going to have a meeting like an advisory board, as Barb referred to, you look for key opinion leaders. There is a fair market calculator that has oversight for how much a physician's time can be paid for. It also, the number of times a single physician can be used. And very candidly, it has oversight all the way down to the venue. And, so for example, you can't hold an advisory board at, say, for example, like Banff Springs, lovely hotel. You can no longer have an advisory board there because it's viewed as an incentive. So I think that world, if it did exist, that world is really tamped down now. It's candidly, the whole world is very litigious now.
That's great to hear, Kevin, and really insightful from what the rumor mill starts to say.
Thanks, Kevin. The next question is for Ned. Has the Ontario SADE project helped with EAP?
So I think Dave asked that aside. Yeah, SADE has been, I think, helpful in terms of, so just a way of background. So the SADE is an electronic prior authorization system that the Ontario government instituted a number of years ago. That was supposed to expedite kind of the EAP approval process in Ontario for high cost drugs through the provincial drug plan. It was introduced, as I said, years ago, but then it had very low utilization. So I think more recently, there was been a push by the Ontario government to make that program, maybe mandatory. I don't know if it's actually become mandatory. That I don't know. And it's a smart move, right? Because it allows for tracking. It allows for it doesn't go into, like, when you submit something, it goes into an ether and you have no idea what's going on with it, right? So I don't know. I haven't seen like efficiency stats or anything like that that would suggest, whether they've gone down from whatever it is, 16 weeks to anything lower than that. There's usually still an element of human intervention involved in it. This allows for better cataloging, tracking, but the actual pharmacist reviewing a lot of these will still have to presumably be involved to a large degree. But I haven't seen any specific stats. Dave, I don't know if you have. I know you're close to.
Yeah, I haven't been following. I think their goal was to have 85% of prior authorizations for exceptional access drugs done instantly real time. So as soon as the pharmacist, the doctor, practitioner, whoever enter their data, there'd be kind of a yes or no right away. And that you take out the human intervention after the fact, that for the other 15%. And I don't know if they hit that number or not, but I know what the target was.
Thanks, Ted. The next question's for Sandy. Sandy, powerful slide on the evolution of high-cost drugs. Do you know the average claim for drugs over 10K from 2005 until now?
I have the best excuse being from the sales and distribution family, but I have my colleague from the clinical team, Fatima Zahra. I'm not really sure if we have at hand access to such data, but perhaps Fatima, if you're still with us on the call, you can tell us more about the stats if available.
And you could grab the CDIPSI numbers to get an idea of the much higher cost numbers, because that does give you a growth year over year.
Is the question?
I'm not sure if she's still with us, but I was seeing the chat.
She's there.
Sorry.
She's there, Sandy.
I'm here.
Fatima.
Can you hear me?
Thank you for joining me.
Great. Can you repeat the question just one more time?
The question was, powerful slide on the evolution of high-cost drugs. Do you know the average claim for drugs over 10K from 2005 until now?
From 2005 until now, no. Top of my head, I do not have this information. But it's something that we can definitely look into.
Could you do that for team and let us know, and then we can blast it out to those that were in attendance today?
Sure. I'll probably need to work with Sandy a little bit on this, just because there's some stats and numbers involved.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay,
great.
Thank you very much. So this question's for Kim. Wouldn't a family physician be able to determine those factors, need, safety, effectiveness, etc., based on what they know about their patient when they're prescribing? Presumably the family physician knows more about the patient than the pharmacist.
Love this question. Love to hate this question. Yeah, so a doctor presumably would know more about a patient from a diagnostic standpoint, maybe has a bit of a better relationship historically. In the current space of things with COVID, that certainly could be contested because doctors are closing their doors and pharmacies are still open. So we are often more in touch with patients than doctors. Then, of course, you've got the issue of education about drugs. So doctors know quite a bit about diagnosing medication or diagnosing conditions, but they get very little in the way of pharmacology. And as compared to us, we get 8 semesters of pharmacology. Then there's whether they have the information they need and the technology to assess what they need to assess at the doctor's office. So picture an emergency physician working at the hospital. They're not going to have access or the time to look at PharmaNet in BC, for example, and collect a full drug history to do an interaction check. And they're not going to have access to that technology at that space. So that's what I would say about that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kim. So in an effort to keep within our time frame, there's multiple other questions that we're certainly not going to get to in this allotted time. So what we'll do is we will reach out to the speakers, send them the questions that we weren't able to address, and absolutely get you answers and send them out to all of you. Again, thank you to the speakers, and I'm going to pass it over to Jay now.
Great. Thanks, Linz. I do again want to say thank you to Kevin, Kim, Ned, and Sandy. Without you guys today, we wouldn't have had a day. So very, very, very appreciated. I want to say thank you to Blake and Lindsay for helping organize today's session. NGBM, if you don't know, runs 4 times a year. There will be another session coming up in roughly 3 months. So stay tuned to the Slack CGIB channel and to our LinkedIn channel, and we'll announce the next session. The next session will be based on questions that you give to us, and it'll be advisors helping advisors to better educate advisors. I also want to say that NGBM comes together because we all met via CGIB. If you are an advisor on this channel and you don't know who CGIB is, you've heard from Dave Patriarch. He started it, and it has been the best education that I have had in my 20 years in the industry. Highly, highly, highly recommend that you get involved, get on Slack, and you will learn more than you've learned in your career and start helping others do their job better. Other than that, I want to say thank you to everybody who attended today. This will be posted on the NGBM LinkedIn YouTube page. So if you do want any specifics, if you missed something, if you forgot something, you want to share it with your clients, we will send you that link. So please stay tuned for that. And other than that, I want to wish everybody a fabulous day and a fabulous 2022. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And